Good afternoon. Welcome to Managing Risk and Due Diligence in the Disaster Context webinar. My name is Jennifer Commander. I am the CFO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Prior to joining CDP, which I've been with now almost 8 years, I spent more than 20 years in the for-profit sector. At CDP, I am responsible for all aspects of finance and operations, including contracts, financial due diligence for grant making, audit and tax compliance, human resources, information technology, and regulatory requirements. As such, I'm really looking forward to today's webinar. Some reminders before we get started. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will answer them primarily at the end of the panel presentation. If you are on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery. That's C as in Charlie, D as in David, P as in Paul, the number 4 recovery to share and join the discussion. And don't forget to follow us at Funds for Disaster. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings to better meet your needs. And finally, we are recording the webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. Live captioning is available now via Zoom. Click on closed caption live transcript to access it. Please note that there will be more accurate captions in the recording. This webinar is co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, Giving Compass, and Peak Grantmaking. We could not offer our webinars without their support. Thank you to all of them. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges that we are working from the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural disaster of colonialism, as well as disasters. We acknowledge when the U.S. was founded, there were exclusions and erasures of Indigenous knowledge about how to appropriately care for these lands, causing environmental destruction and degradation, which has had a significant impact on disaster risk and on communities. We are committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy. We commit ourselves to understand where and how wealth accumulation has harmed people and the earth itself, and the complexities of philanthropy as connected to that truth. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, there is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us and acknowledge the original peoples and their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. Adrian, let's close the poll now. At the end of the webinar, funders will be aware of how a typical grant-making process may create systemic barriers and bottlenecks for communities of color, and learn about examples to reduce them. Understand the different requirements for due diligence and expenditure responsibility processes, and discover opportunities to accept more risks and disrupt traditional models of grant-making that exist within your organization. As you can see, the poll results are on your screen, and definitely answers across the board. The ones with the ones that with the highest vote, the application form is often long and duplicative, and the process is time consuming. Really not shocked. I don't think any of the panelists would be shocked that those were the top two most selected answers. So thank you for participating in the poll. Now it is my honor to introduce our special guests. I'm looking forward to the information that they will share with us. Remy Barnwell serves as staff counsel at the Council on Foundations and believes in the power of philanthropy to improve the world on an individual, local, and global scale. Prior to her service at the Council, Remy served as attorney advisor at the Federal Labor Relations Authority. We also have Katrina Julien joining us today. Katrina serves as Senior Program Officer at the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, where she is focused on the foundation's place-based portfolio. Katrina's commitment to the Atlanta region aims to uplift and amplify resident voices in decision-making to advance social and economic mobility in their communities. Her role within community supports the foundation's mission of increasing equity and shared prosperity throughout the region. And last but not least, my colleague at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, our grants manager, Audrey Kidwell. Prior to joining CDP, Audrey worked with Volunteer Florida as the program manager for the Volunteer Generation Fund, a program that increases the capacity of organizations to recruit, manage, support, and retain skills-based volunteers to serve in high-value volunteer assignments. She also has been a Peace Corps volunteer in Burkina Faso and AmeriCorps Vista in Miami, Florida. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. Remy, I'm going to ask you a few questions to help set the stage before I turn to Katrina and Audrey. To start, what are the range of resources that COF provides to grant makers and foundations, and what is your role specifically?
So the Council has a lot of different resources for both our members and non-members. We have different membership types from community foundations, private grant makers, grant-making public charities, and non-US charities. And we offer things like reports that offer the annual grant maker salary and benefits, disaster grant making and response to specific disaster reports. We have a toolkit for values aligned philanthropy, which is something that we recently launched to help foundations ensure that the organizations that they're making grants to follow the values of both the community and the foundation itself. On the legal side, we also have a compendium of legal resources, which has chapters on topics ranging from the basics of running a community foundation to getting into the nitty-gritty of the public support test. We also offer peer communities to our members, advocacy and lobbying workshops, in addition to advocacy and lobbying resources. So my role at the Council is as one of two staff counsels. I'm one of the attorneys on staff, and what I do on a day-to-day basis is help our members specifically ensure that they're in alignment with the Internal Revenue Code, and connect our members with each other when there are instances where issues could be solved through peer communication.
And just to clarify, you mentioned, I believe at the beginning, that these resources are available to both members and non-members alike. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Jennifer. I appreciate the clarification. So some of our resources are available for a fee, while others are available for free to non-members. And then with a membership, you get access to all of our materials for free. The compendium of legal resources we sell by the chapter if you're not a member. And on our website, you can find a list of the available chapters. I believe there are about 16 out right now.
Thank you. Can you explain the differing requirements for due diligence and expenditure responsibility?
Yeah.
And maybe even give a little bit of a clarification for those on the call who might not understand that there are two different things.
Yeah, absolutely. So expenditure responsibility is a requirement that the Internal Revenue Service put into place through Section 4945H of the Internal Revenue Code. And what expenditure responsibility does is it requires private foundations and some public charities to follow a set of rules when they're making any grant to an organization that's not a public charity. Due diligence, on the other hand, you can kind of think of it as like the little sister of expenditure responsibility. If expenditure responsibility is Barbie, then due diligence is Kelly. It's a little bit smaller. There's not a statute requiring due diligence or really explaining exactly what that is, but many foundations have their own due diligence policy, which involves communicating with the potential grantee, verifying their public charity status or private foundation status, reviewing the projects that they're going to partake in, and looking at their impact on the community. So due diligence is a little bit squishier than expenditure responsibility, which, as you can see here, has 5 basic steps. So for expenditure responsibility, you have to make a pre-grant inquiry to the potential grantee, making sure that you understand what the project is that the grantee plans to undertake. There needs to be a written agreement between you as the grant maker and the grantee, specifying the parameters of the project. Any funds have to be kept in a separate account. There need to be regular reports sent to the grant maker from the grantee, letting the grant maker know how all funds are spent. And then finally, if you're at a private foundation, then you'll have to report to the IRS on your annual tax returns, any grants that were made using expenditure responsibility. So I'll just reiterate that with due diligence, there's no predetermined process. There are no predetermined steps. Up to each grant maker to determine what works best for them, and the universe is very big. The purpose of due diligence and expenditure responsibility is to ensure that funds are being used for the charitable purpose that the grant maker intended for them to be used.
Thank you. I'd like to point out, I like this bullet point that you have here. That's not a bullet point, the star about public charities, where it says that public charities only have to be concerned with expenditure responsibility if they are the sponsor of a donor advised fund. And is that the only situation where a public charity would have to follow expenditure responsibility?
It is, and thanks for pointing out that star. So if a public charity houses a donor advised fund, you probably know that donor advised funds are subject to rules that are similar to private foundations. So any donor advised fund that wants to make a grant to a non-charity has to exercise expenditure responsibility, but no other grant from a charity, as long as it's from a fund that is a non-donor advised fund, will have to go through expenditure responsibility.
Thank you for that clarification. Finally, what are the core requirements from the IRS for funders, both community foundations and private foundations, that they could use during a disaster?
Yeah, I think The core guidelines, the core requirements that I would state is granting to public charities is always your best option, no matter what kind of grant maker you are. If you're making a grant to a public charity, you don't have to be concerned with expenditure responsibility or the due diligence requirements that we went over. There are lots of public charities in all geographic areas. Community foundations are a great example that tend to serve a community and know exactly what that community needs. And when you're thinking about the requirements that the IRS has imposed, I would think of them much more of a floor than a ceiling. I know that going through the requirements of expenditure responsibility may seem like a really heavy lift, but at the end of the day, they just want to ensure that the money that you're granting is serving the purpose that you hope that it serves. I also think that it's good to note as a grant maker, if you're ever unsure if you need to report something, then report it first rather than non-reporting and then asking questions later. It's always better to be safe than sorry. And as I mentioned, the council is a membership organization, and one of our benefits to members is access to me and our other attorney, Ben, and we answer on-demand questions all the time for emergency and disaster grant making.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Audrey. Audrey, what does CDP's current grant making process look like?
Yeah, so this past year, CDP has spent a considerable amount of time looking at our grant making. While we definitely have been grant making, I think, for a long time, we really wanted to revamp or reevaluate our processes internally. I think you could say that like the stars aligned. We had growth on our grants team over the previous year. We've increased our grant dollars and we've onboarded an online grant management system. And so all of these factors really made us set out to create this change management process. So the first thing we did was we partnered with the Center for Effective Philanthropy to survey our grantee partners on how we can be better grant makers. The survey covered like a wide range of topics, but allowed our grantee partners to provide feedback on our processes, relationships, RIE work, and other areas. The outcome of the report is actually on our website, and oh, it's the previous slide. So yeah, the outcome of the report is on our website, and it's hyperlinked here in the PDF as well that you'll get after. If you wanted to take a deeper dive into some of those results. But overall, having this feedback from our grantee partners was really great as we moved through this change management process. But, you know, our grant making team really had this desire to embed our localization and RIE, the racial and intersectional equity principles, into our grant making work. We take pride in CDP's RIE values, but wanted to make sure that our grant making process is really aligned with those. So I have the goals here listed on the screen, but as I stated before, we just really wanted to make sure that our values on RIE, localization, and trust-based philanthropy were embedded in the actual grant making practices, the processes, and the forms that we use. So we covered all aspects of grant making from start to finish, including our due diligence. Not just like the documents that we do need for due diligence, but how do we want to receive them? When do we need to see them? What should they look like? You know, all of those great things. We spent months going through a series of workshops to understand what we wanted to keep or change as part of our process. And then the resources listed on the screen were places that we use to kind of help guide our conversations around trust-based philanthropy and incorporating diversity into our grant making. And so basically, I share all of this to say that we've invested a lot of time into revamping our grant making process, but haven't completed all of our goals. We're in the implementation phase of this process. And as with most things, as we onboard a new form or a new procedure, it seems to lead to something else or like a whole new set of questions that us as grant makers have to discuss. So just kind of an overview of our current grant making process, but can definitely share more at a future date.
And a couple clarification questions. The review process went all the way from due diligence requirements, things that we're going to ask from our grantee, from the application to reporting, through the entirety of the process from start to finish. Is that accurate?
Yeah. We started kind of with a like pre-application, like what are we doing before we reach out and ask individuals or organizations to apply, to the application, what our staff reviews, what type of questions we ask in a final report, how do we share that information with marketing or our development team. So we've really kind of laid out this entire grant making year or process, and then really inserted change or updates in pretty much every aspect.
Excellent. And just to clarify for those who may not be as aware of CDP, we are a public charity. So we are not required to do expenditure responsibility, but we do have a very, as Audrey said, very extensive due diligence process that we put into place. And RIE, which is laid out here as racial and intersectional equity, is the terminology that we use within our organization for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So just to make that clear for anyone who might not be as familiar with CDP. Audrey, I'm going to continue with you and ask the next question. How does a typical grant making process flow make funding more complicated for small or emerging groups, especially those led by under-resourced communities?
So when I think about grant making, I kind of visualize the grant making process as like small stages or segments that kind of make up a whole process. So for example, you'll have, in some typical grant flows, you'll have an application stage, a review stage, maybe you'll do a contracting stage, and so on, right? It'll take you through maybe a full calendar year or 2 years. And then this kind of help moves this organization or this applicant through these different stages, depending on, maybe if they get awarded, they follow this type of flow versus if they get declined, or you might have different grant flows depending on the types of funding that you provide to your community partners. In my experience, the biggest lift or complication for under-resourced communities comes from the funder and is usually in the early part of the grant making cycle. So like more specifically, it's typically the application, the review, and the contracting stage, which I think from the poll, we definitely saw that people did note that the application piece is sometimes can be a problem depending on the type of grant and application. So this is, typically when the funder wants to get as much information as possible. So I think sometimes funders think that it makes sense to ask a bunch of stuff up front, especially if it's a new organization to the funder's portfolio. So an example is kind of like the application itself, which, has writing prompts, budget, due diligence documents. Maybe you guys ask for a letter of reference and so on. So some of the issues or barriers to applying for funds is the actual application itself, but it could be the length of time it takes to apply, how the application needs to be completed. Under-resourced communities might not have reliable access to internet or even access to some of these documents at all, or the time frame that you're asking them to apply is just so quick for them to turn around an application, especially for those organizations that have experienced a disaster or are in some sort of crisis. At CDP, we're funding organizations all over the world experiencing different types of disasters. Our grant makers really try to connect with the communities we're granting in. We understand that grant making isn't this one size fits all, and what works for one community or organization might not work for others. So I've listed a few ways here that we try to alleviate some of the burden on our grantee partners. The big thing is that we really prioritize medium and long-term recovery, waiting weeks or months after a disaster to provide funding. So that way we're not overloading the organization and the communities that they're serving, especially for those that have just experienced some sort of disaster. We really try to be flexible and meet our grantee partners where they are. This includes alternative applications. We do have an online system to collect grant applications, but we have community partners in rural areas or in active disasters, so we've allowed them to complete a paper application. We also try to be flexible on the application period, working with the community partner to see, is 2 weeks good enough? Is a month? Like, what could that process look like for them? And then we do try to take on administrative burden on behalf of the grantee partner. So for an example, again, is if an international organization submits due diligence documents in another language, our grant makers first try to work to translate those documents versus like sending it back and having them do it. Again, if they provide it in English and in another language, we accept that, but we really try to do that on behalf of them. And then lastly, transparency is really key. I think a lot of the barriers for organizations can just be alleviated by them knowing the grant process of their funder. So I definitely suggest share your timelines, not just when an application's due, but like, when should they hear something back? How long is a review period? What's the funding? How long is the funding for? Do they get one payment, multiple payments? Do they have to submit receipts? Is there a training involved? All of that type of stuff that happens over an entire grant year to really make it helpful for them. And then, something that CDP has done recently is listed copies of our application, our budget template, and all of the due diligence documents that we do require on our website. So hopefully it's helpful to grantee partners as they are applying for grants for us.
I think something else that may be interesting to the group, Audrey, is our grant makers from a reporting process will even take a oral report. If it's just too much for the grantee to actually do a written report, they'll just sit down with them on the phone or in person when possible, and then actually write up the report for the grantee. So that's another way in which you can be supportive of more local organizations that don't have the capacity to work at the same level as a larger charitable organization. Anything else to add to that, Audrey, before we move on to Katrina?
No, thank you.
Okay, Katrina. The Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta has also been grappling with the concept of doing philanthropy differently for a number of years. Can you tell us how you have approached embedding equity and what, if anything, changed after 2020?
Sure. I think like many of us, everything changed in 2020. I consider that to be one of the most impactful disasters that have happened globally for us. And so we had to grapple with, prior to 2020, we were already having conversations around, how to embed equity into our programming and our work more broadly. What does that mean for our donors and for our communities? And then, how do we move forward and implement that in a very new and different way? And, honestly, in 2019, we were ready to do that in a very careful and selective way, not as explicit as 2020 pushed us into being. And so, we had this really beautiful original strategic plan laid out around how we were going to start to engage in these equity conversations and do a really diligent process around it with community. But then 2020 happened and everything just changed, right? There was this sense of urgency that wasn't there before, where we had to be explicit around community need and really around community voice. The social justice uprisings in 2020, along with a global pandemic, really highlighted for us the value of being dedicated to place and to centering people and activating voice in that way. And so we went back to the drawing board and we created a new strategic plan that was intentional and explicit and called out what we needed to do here in Atlanta, which is have a really intentional focus on racial equity and what that means for our communities. And then working with those communities to make change and have impact in their lives. And that's a lot of what this slide talks about, how we center people in place in all of the work that we're doing, how we do it across the 4 systems, housing and neighborhoods, income and wealth, power and leadership, and then arts and culture, which usually seems to be an aside to the more hardcore work. But really what arts and culture does, both as an economic driver for our region and as a way for community members to tell their own stories in their own ways, is a way that we are trying to reimagine what activating community voice is like.
That's incredible. Very interesting. I know that you have been having conversations about the unnecessary barriers that you unintentionally put in place that prevent small grassroots groups from being able to apply. How have you all reimagined ways to create the systems that bring in the smaller organizations?
Yeah, and this is such an interesting conversation because, you know, listening to Remy start on the conversation talking about due diligence and what we need to have as foundations in order to have our processes and systems aligned and to be able to make those grants and ensure that the work is being done equitably is something that we keep at the forefront. But then also recognizing that a lot of what we ask for, especially for small grassroots organizations, are not necessary. You know, when I started at the foundation, organizations needed to be 501c3s for at least 2 years before even being able to apply for a grant with the foundation, and they had to have at least 2 years of audited financial statements, which for a smaller organization can be a hardship. Those financial, audited financial statements are quite an expensive process and something that most small to mid-sized organizations can't do annually. And so we started to look at how can we get the information that we need to do our jobs without unnecessarily creating more burden on the organizations and communities that we are trying to impact. And so what we did is we began to have listening sessions with our nonprofit partners, with our community leaders and stakeholders, and really just ask them candidly, what types of things do we do that creates more obstacles for the process and for your ability to get access to funding? And then we clarified language. We tried really hard to get out of our own way. In that way, sometimes we have our own foundation speak, and we put it on our applications and in our guidelines, and we make things way more complicated. And so we clarified our language. We updated our grant cycles. We removed some of those unnecessary pieces to the applications and to supplements that we really didn't need. And then we right-sized the financial requirements for the size of the organization, right? So an organization with under 5 employees is not in a annual budget under $100,000 or under $50,000 is not going to have the same due diligence and processes for a larger organization. And so, we really worked to create individual kind of application processes depending on the size of the organization. And then we lastly just decided that, for these smaller organizations, some of which are fully volunteer led, that adjusting some of the staffing requirements that we had in place was something that we needed to do. And it's helped us to get to those organizations that we really wanted to be in relationship with.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. That's I think it's so important for all of us to start thinking out of the box, right? Because if we really want to go local and reach these organizations that don't have access to funds like larger nonprofits, we have to start thinking this way and being flexible. So I applaud you and the community for really taking this on and moving it forward. Audrey,
Yeah.
I'm gonna move to you. What does CDP do in blue sky times? Are there blue sky times? There are, right?
I know. As I was creating this, I was thinking like, sometimes there's blue skies in a certain part of the world or
The world,
region, and then
right.
it's not somewhere else. So
So what do we do in those times to be prepared when a disaster strikes?
yeah. So CDP, we really try to prepare for what's next, or kind of evaluate like what wasn't working to make it better for next time. So some of the things that we practice here at CDP is our pre-check process. This is a way of completing due diligence on an organization ahead of time to help us assess the grantee partner's potential for grants from us or other funders. Immediately after a disaster, donors have this desire to help. They want to respond quickly, but they don't always know which organizations to support or how to make the best use of their funds, especially for long-term recovery. So we want to be able to get this information ahead of time in the event of a disaster. So we have the information ready, and we're able to kind of like, to jump in and to help in whatever way is needed. We also practice shoe leather philanthropy, so completing site visits to disaster affected areas. Our grant makers are always taking part in community and regional meetings, building relationship with organization and other funders. We believe this is the best tool that we have to effectively allocate dollars for medium and long-term recovery. It helps us to know key individuals and organizations in communities. So when there is a disaster, we have like this pre-existing connection to help understand the needs of the community, what needs are needed. And then kind of to tie it back to my first slide, we're really committed to evaluating and revamping our grant making process. We want to know that we have good processes and practices in place so we can effectively provide resources to those grantee partners and communities they serve, right? So it's not just like being like, great, here's a really cool application, but we know that like we can get it out in a timely manner. We can get it back. We can move it through a process. So that way funds don't take, years to get to places. It can be a pretty quick turnaround if needed. We're really committed to that. And so that, again, these are just some of the practices that we work on at CDP.
Thank you, Audrey. Appreciate that. I have one more question for Katrina, and then we're going to move to the audience Q&A section. So here's your opportunity. Don't forget to add your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Katrina, one of the other challenges many nonprofits report, especially during a crisis, is in reporting. How have you been exploring options for reporting on grants?
Yeah, well, I'll start with telling a little story about when I first entered into the philanthropic space, and had the experience of having to read mid and end of year grant reports, and I had this question. I said, well, what do we do with these reports after we read them? After we check the box and say, okay, they did the work that they said they were going to do, and they spent the funds in a way that adhere to their original grant agreement. What do we do with them? And what I was told is that we file them away, and then we go on to something else. And first, I thought these are really long reports to just file away. And it also is really impactful and interesting and exciting information that a lot of the groups that we work with are doing. And what a better way to be able to tell the story of what's happening in community than with actually utilizing and using the voice of the nonprofits and our community stakeholders in that way. And so, we had to first think about what do we need from these reports? What don't we need? Similar to our application process. And we started to just try to right size it. And then, also think about, is a written report the only thing we need? I think someone earlier mentioned, video reports, and that's something that we're looking into doing because it helps to tell the story. Shortening the amount of information that we need for reports, and then reimagining how we get that information at the end of a grant cycle or grant agreement. So usually we do site visits with organizations, as we are considering whether or not to fund them. And it's this really tense and unnecessarily just hard process for nonprofits who have to kind of be on and prove to us that they deserve this money. And so what we decided was, how about instead of just doing site visits, then we schedule visits when funding is not on the line, for them to give us an update and tell us what they're doing in community. And we'll work with our marketing and communications team to help tell that story. And we've done that in a multitude of ways, including having our grantees actually do blog posts for us, and to work with our local news organization to post those, not just on our site, but on the Atlanta Business Chronicle and things like that. So it's a way to activate voice in a different way, in an organic way, and to still get that information that we need.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to Q&A. We have had a few questions come in, and I'm going to start with Remy. The question came in that said, are there similar IRS requirements for foundation funding to Indian tribes?
Yeah, so I saw that question come in, and so the requirements are not similar to expenditure responsibility or due diligence. It's actually going to be more like making a grant to a unit of government if you're funding an Indian tribe. The IRS actually has a list, and I can send the link to someone so that we can get the link to you. But the IRS has a list of 562 tribal entities that it recognizes and are eligible for tax exempt grants, just like if you were going to grant to a city or a state government. So it's going to be more like granting to government than granting under expenditure responsibility.
Does that trigger then a special audit requirement?
No, it does not trigger any special audit requirement. It doesn't trigger any additional process. If you are a public charity, then you're going to make the grant just like you would to another public charity. If you're at a private foundation, then the grant is going to be just like you're making it to a public charity. The only thing that I would say is all of this is assuming that the Indian tribe that you're granting to is one of the 562 on the list. I mean, it probably is, but I just want to add that little caveat.
And any advice if it's not on the list?
Yeah, if it's not on the list, then my advice would be to grant to that tribe and exercise whatever your organization's due diligence policy is. I wouldn't say that you need to rise to the level of expenditure responsibility because it is still essentially a government entity, but I would be very shocked if it's not on the list.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the next question, I think Audrey or Katrina could jump in on this. Have any of you had experience, and this is with a multi-finder, but I think it means with a multi-funder application process. We are hoping to offer a streamlined application that multiple funders, I believe, could use to support the long-term recovery process. Would love any insight or experience with this. Have any thoughts, Audrey or Katrina, on one application process?
This is Katrina. I feel like we have had those conversations, but nothing has come to fruition as of yet. A lot of our relationships with funders have I guess come away with us doing, supporting multiple projects or the similar projects together, but we haven't streamlined it as of yet into one process. I think some of it has been, in our wish list of things to do once we come out of the pandemic and can really begin to focus and rebuild and really strengthen our strategy, but not just yet.
And Audrey, remind me, I know you're much closer to this than I am. Do we have still two different applications, one for domestic and international, or have we now combined them as part of the change management process?
We still have separate. So what we did was we have a domestic application, which covers all of the funds. And then we have an international for US based organizations, and then an application for international non-US based. That way, because I don't like non-US based organizations don't have like a US tax ID, and they have different due diligence documents that we ask for them. So we kind of separated that application out for our international team. So it's hopefully easier for the grantee partner to complete.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Many small new organizations can be delayed due to seeking fiscal sponsorship. I think we've all experienced that. Do you have any solutions related to facilitating fiscal sponsorships in a timely manner? I am with a community foundation. Katrina, have you had any experience?
Yes. So there are times when our foundation has actually become the fiscal sponsor for an organization. That's very rare, though. We try not to make it a habit. But if the program or project is something that is really clearly aligned with our scope of work, then that's something that we'll do. Or we play matchmaker and kind of try to figure out, are there other organizations that we have relationships with that can actually do that fiscal sponsorship process for that organization. And so those are the quickest ways that we've been able to do that. But a third thing that the foundation has that is a little different is that we have a program called the Neighborhood Fund, which gives small grants to organizations that aren't necessarily 501c3s. And so it's a very specific process. It's a small grant up to $10,000 for a community-led project, but it removes that barrier or that necessity of having a fiscal sponsor for a small organization and allows us to be able to support them. We also provide them with a project management coach. So if that's a community group that is not as savvy in the program management or philanthropic space, we have someone who helps them with that.
Thank you. Audrey, a question came in for you. What is the process to be included on your pre-checklist?
Yeah, thank you. I will say I don't have it open, but all of the information is definitely on CDP's website, and we can make sure that you get a link to that. But it is open for 501c3s, or if you have a fiscal sponsor, they need to be a 501c3. And there's an email to where you would ask to be put on our pre-checklist. But basically you would submit your due diligence documents for our team to review. So such as an audit, 990, and oh, yep, good. Tanya just dropped it in the chat there for you. But basically you're just submitting your due diligence documents. There's no like actual like grant application that comes with it.
Thank you. Question came in, is there a philanthropic sector promising practice on how to exit communities once a funder decides to stop funding in that geographical or programmatic area? I don't know if any of the three panelists have any thoughts on that.
I'll take a stab at it.
Sure, thank you.
Sure, and I'll give a very specific example. So as a part of the place-based work that I do here in Atlanta, we support a small neighborhood called Thomasville Heights. It's in Southeast Atlanta. And we have been working with them for 6 years with housing related to residents being in housing that wasn't, wasn't fit to live. And so we underwent this process that relocated residents to more suitable housing. And the process became bigger than we intended. And what was supposed to be temporary relocation and then return of residents has the potential of becoming permanent displacement of those residents. So they have not just moved out of the community, but they have moved out of the city of Atlanta to the broader metropolitan Atlanta area. And so what we were committed to is supporting those residents in their transition, because those transitional processes are traumatic and they're long, and they require a lot of supportive services and wraparound supports in order for those residents to be able to thrive long term. But what that does for my work is that once they are no longer in that neighborhood, it's no longer a place-based project, or it's not in my purview. And so we're having conversation, because we have this two-pronged approach to our strategy, is it moves from my place-focused strategy to the systems, the policy and advocacy pieces. And so the program officer who is dedicated to housing now takes the support of those residents under their portfolio and make sure that we can have longer term supports for them while I'm still able to be focused and dedicated on a specific place. Does that make sense? So sometimes you have to work within a team or a system so that you can be able to handle both. And it takes a little practice to get it right.
Thank you, Katrina. Follow up for both Katrina and Audrey. Reporting is obviously helpful to know what a group has done, right? And that they've spent the money the way they said that they were going to. But during a disaster, counting widgets or number of things done, people served is challenging. What kind of questions do you really want to know after a grant? What is important to you? Or does it depend on the grant?
Yeah, this is Audrey. I was going to say, I think it depends on the grant. I also think that it maybe depends on where the funding is coming from at some point. Like what do our donors want to know? But, after reevaluating a lot of our grants processes and forms this year, we really asked every single question, why are we asking this? Who at our agency wants to know this? Why do they want to know? So it was really great for us to think about that end result, at least as if that it's, the end result as it stays within CDP, right? Is this information that goes onto a blog on a regular basis? Does it get shared with the board? Stuff like that. So it's hard to say specific questions that are helpful or standard across the board. I think it's just kind of the where does it go once you have the answer to that? I will say it's sometimes helpful if you ask all of your grantee partners the same question or very similar one. So if you are trying to see the trends or the data year after year, you have something actually to compare it to, if you're asking one person number served versus number of houses built, you can't really compare the data at the end if you're not asking similar questions across the board. But yeah, it's very tricky. I think that at CDP, a lot of the data that we share, within our annual report and with our board of directors and on the website, some of that information comes in the application, the state, where the funding is being, where the funding's going, the type of projects you plan to do, information like that you can collect up front, or you could collect at the end, which I think is also could be equally valuable.
Yeah.
Katrina.
I agree. I think the only thing I'll add is that, because the foundation isn't, solely focused on disaster funding, I think one of the things that we to ensure is that we, that the funding was flexible enough so that the grantees were able to impact the communities that they needed to in a quickly, and that the process didn't hold up the support of those residents in that time, which is really critical. And so just making sure that we didn't unnecessarily or unwittingly create more work, or create an additional barrier to support in a disaster, is something that we want to make sure that we know, and that we can fix or pivot at the next turn.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for questions today. But as we begin to wrap up, I want to provide the audience with some actionable thoughts from our conversation. First, examine your due diligence and grant making processes, including your application questions and reporting requirements. We've talked a lot about that today. Make sure you're only asking grantee partners to do what is necessary. Look for ways that you can decrease the burden and time, especially in a time of crisis. Remy's information about what the IRS actually requires could be very helpful here as well. Ask yourself what the value is of each step or hoop you put your grantees and your staff through. Are reports, as Katrina mentioned, only sitting on shelves or perhaps computer files these days? Or are they being examined, compared, and shared? Invite your grantee partners to provide feedback on your process. As we mentioned earlier, CDP recently had a grantee perception report. This helped us learn what was working and what wasn't. It is also influencing the work that Audrey mentioned to ensure that CDP is meeting the needs of its grantees, while also meeting the requirements of the IRS, our donors, and our board. You can find many resources that can assist you on CDP's website. They are listed here, so I won't repeat them word for word, but we've got blogs, we've got webinar videos, we've got disaster insights, the playbook, a ton of information that's available for you at any time. We have a monthly newsletter full of information, including our weekly What We're Watching blog that highlights disasters around the world. And our staff is always available to provide guidance. And if you need more in-depth assistance, we also provide a variety of consulting services. You can find more information, as I mentioned, about our work at disasterphilanthropy.org. We are working on an exciting series of webinars in 2023. It's hard to believe, but we're almost at the end of 2022. They will be held on the second Thursday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern. Please mark these dates on your calendar so you don't miss them. We are just a minute from 3 o'clock. So in order for 3 o'clock Eastern, I should say, in order to respect everyone's time, that's all the time for today's webinar. We thank you. We thank our co-sponsors, and we certainly give huge thanks to Remy, Katrina, and Audrey for taking the time to share their insights today. Please take a moment to complete our post-webinar survey to let us know what you liked and what you would like to see in future webinars. It will pop up automatically when you exit the webinar. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to Tanya Gulliver Garcia. That's tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. And that is also on your screen. Thank you again for your time and your attention. Have a great afternoon and happy holidays if we don't see you again before 2023. Thanks for coming.